Okay. Um, I am really excited about this technological competition and decoupling panel. Basically, I was given the instructions you can invite whoever you want. And I was like, cool. I do research in this area. I'm going to pick like the three people who I think are doing the most incisive, thoughtful, interesting work. And they all said yes. So, really excited to welcome first Yeling Tan. She's a professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Just want to say one quick thing about each person's work. So her Disaggregating China Inc. book, there's just this really cool detailed analysis of how indigenous innovation is implemented at the local level. And there's this awesome anecdote from one interviewee where like the foreign companies put on a red hat in response to indigenous innovation policy, but the underlying tech is still foreign. So it gives you a sense of how on the ground the analysis is, and I'm really looking forward to her presentation. Next, we'll have Dr. Roselyn Hsueh. She's an associate professor of political science at Temple University, and her work, China's regulatory state, I really appreciate the emphasis on the strategic value of different sectors and how that shapes China's regulatory policy and to the extent that the state retains control over critical sectors. And then lastly, we'll have Dr. Ling Chen, assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. Her book, Manipulating Globalization, looks at local policymaking on tech upgrading, and where the center has this sort of ambiguous notion of indigenous innovation, and then local policymakers have to adapt while they're still balancing all these industrial output targets and overall economic outputs, and where foreign firms are still important contributors. So I'm excited to see what they say as they've advanced their research. And obviously, it's not like this is bottom of the agenda in this city or anything. So really exciting to see the conversation that follows. So let me invite up Dr. Tan first, and we'll get going.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for such a kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to be here. So there's obviously quite a lot of attention these days on China's shift towards self-reliance amidst tensions between the US and China on technology and trade. What I'd like to do today is contextualize the current moment that we're in and then end by talking about some implications. So in terms of contextualization, this emphasis on self-reliance is not necessarily new, right? So self-reliance is a pretty strongly held concept in CCP ideology, right? It was quite salient in the Maoist period under the planned economy. But when you dig into the history of this concept of self-reliance, it goes even further back than that to pre-PRC period. So here we have Mao talking about the basis of the CCP's policy in 1945, right? We base it on our own strength, which is called self-reliance. And you can even go prior to the 1940s into the 1930s of the CCP's experience of being in the Yan'an base. And that's where some of the contours of what the party means by self-reliance was forged. But this concept is by no means unique to just the C period or just the Mao period, right? Here we have Deng Xiaoping in the Reform and Opening period, right? In a speech in 1978 saying, well, of course, right, in order to raise China's scientific and technological levels, we must rely on our own efforts, develop our own creativity, persist in the policy of independence and self-reliance. He goes on to say, but independence does not mean shutting the door on the world, nor does self-reliance mean blind opposition to everything foreign. So what we could take away from these three snapshots, right, from Xi and Mao and the Deng period, is that self-reliance is obviously a core concept, right? It's not new, yet it's a concept that's subject to redefinition over time. So as we dive into this question of the relationship between self-reliance and technology today, right, it's obviously going to be a combination of domestic politics shaping the contours of the contestation, right, how it's redefined, but also the external environment. So for technology in particular, right, what one aspect of the redefinition that I want to emphasize is that because technology is inherently about uncertainty, it operates in a complex environment, policymakers have to navigate a whole lot of unknown unknowns, right? So learning about the relative balance between the vulnerabilities associated with globalization versus the opportunities is going to be part of that redefining process. So it's going to be a process of politics, but also about policy learning. Today, I'm going to share just some figures from an ongoing project that focuses on the external. I have a separate paper that looks more at the domestic. But I want to emphasize and look at the effects of two external, what we call knowledge shocks that have occurred in the Xi Jinping period. The 2013 Snowden revelations, right, and its impact on cyber governance, and then the technology restrictions coming from the United States from 2018 onwards, and examine how the Chinese party states' reactions to these external knowledge shocks have been filtered through in a domestic context where the Xi administration already has a predilection towards centralization and has emphasized this theme of national rejuvenation. So looking at how these external shocks filter through and how the Chinese system reacts in the Xi period. So before jumping into the effects of the Snowden revelations, right, I think some scene setting would be useful. What did cyber governance look like prior to 2013? Here, I'm just building on a lot of existing solid scholarship on the state of governance in this area, right, where existing scholars have already kind of mapped out the state of fairly fragmented, not highly coordinated policymaking, where authority was very much dispersed across many of these agencies that you see here on the screen, right? The public security, state security, MIIT, the People's Liberation Army, and so on, right? Absent higher level guidance, right? There was fierce interagency competition. So the outcome in terms of what the governance landscape looked like was in a sense, didn't reflect a national posture, but reflected the result of this interagency competition. And then we have the Snowden revelations, which are a knowledge shock, right, to not just China, but also to the rest of the world, that shifts this this situation. So let me just take a little bit of time to walk you through what this figure is all about. So my co-authors and I collected an original corpus of newspaper articles from over 615 newspapers across a 16-year period. And we were interested in newspaper articles from China's official state media that were related to technology. So just the technology articles across the 16-year period, it's a corpus of roughly over 500,000 articles. And then we did some very basic textual analysis to look at the prevalence of different types of themes within these articles, which are all related to innovation and technology. What you're seeing here is the prevalence of phrases related to technology security, right? And the vertical line, the dotted vertical line is when Xi Jinping becomes general secretary. And then that shaded bar is the period during which the world's media started to release and discuss and publish the previously classified documents that were leaked by Edward Snowden. And what you see here is that prior to the Snowden leaks, right, there's a fairly stable, low level of phrases related to technology security. After the Snowden revelations, what we see is, you would naturally expect there to be greater media interest in the revelations. But what's interesting to us is that the increased discussion about network security is permanently elevated rather than going back down. So then the next thing we wanted to figure out is, well, what's being discussed? How are the elite ranks of Chinese government agencies processing and talking about these Snowden revelations, right? So let me just give you some snippets, right? So we were particularly interested not just in the mass dailies, right, that are targeted at the general audience, but specific publications that are targeted internally within the party state, right? So for example, the People's Liberation Army Daily talks about how the exposure of one of these programs sounded an alarm for the international community, and then talks about the importance of therefore walking this path of independent innovation. A different newspaper, the Study Times, this is the newspaper put out by the Central Party School, which is the training institution for the elite ranks of the CCP cadres. And it talks about how the Snowden incident, right, once again brought a significant shock to China, and discusses how China cannot be tenants in cyberspace, must make breakthroughs in key technologies to build an independent and trustworthy network security defense system. And over time, what we see is the elevation of cyber governance to become a concept that's core to how the CCP thinks about its regime security. And what we can see this elevation in a speech that Xi Jinping gives in August of 2013, where he references some of the surveillance plans that were revealed by the leaks, and saying it's clear that the internet activity ability of the US and scale have far exceeded people's imagination, and talks about how the battlefield, right, of the internet is directly connected to the country's both ideological and political security. So following this kind of elevation, what we see is a series of institutional moves, right, and a restructuring of that previously fragmented landscape that I outlined earlier. So in 2014, there is a high-level central leading small group on network security that's formed. A few years later, it's formalized into a commission within the Central Committee on Cyberspace Affairs, which allows the party to exert greater coordination amongst these various competing agencies. And then we see legislative tightening as well, right? Existing laws are amended to bring greater attention to network security. And then there's a network security law that's put forward in 2016. So this is a very quick overview of what's happening in the cyberspace arena. Let me now switch to the other knowledge shock, which is the science and technology governance and the linkage to some of the technology restrictions that have been coming out from the US since 2018. So again, in terms of scene setting, right, when it comes to S&T governance, it's again this kind of fragmented landscape within China where you have authority dispersed across multiple agencies. There's some very interesting literature that talks about competition between what these scholars call either techno-nationalists on the one hand and techno-globalists on the other hand, right? And this just gives you a snapshot of some of the many different both government agencies, but also think tanks, university labs, private sector firms, state-owned firms that are all part of the innovation landscape. But they're all, at least prior to 2018, by and large operating under an overarching guidance of trying to draw in cutting edge foreign technology, digest it, absorb it, indigenize it, right? And this brings us to thinking about how this overall technology posture then also has a knock-on effect on other countries and has a knock-on effect on US policy towards China, right? So the two countries are very much feeding off and learning from each other. And building on the very important work by Margaret Pearson, Kelly Tsai, and Meg Rithmeyer, they talk about the rise of party state capitalism, right? And so fears of technology policies like made in China and 2025 and so on creates what they call a security dilemma, and feeds into a change in US posture. And we see this change in US posture, so I'm bringing us up to date to current affairs now. And what is the reaction coming from China? So again, this is our analysis of the technology and innovation articles, right? And you can see the black line here showing you the prevalence of phrases related to decoupling. So choke points, independent and controllable technology, things like that. And you can see a clear, I guess you could call it an escalation in concern and interest in themes related to decoupling quite clearly from 2018 onwards, right? And I've just marked out some of the key events. They're by no means exhaustive. So again, what then do these, how are these technology restrictions being discussed in official media? Let me give you a few snippets. So the Science and Technology Daily, which is overseen by the Ministry of Science and Technology, talks about how the sales ban against ZTE was a wake-up call, right? And discusses the need to let China never be choked by others when it comes to technology, right? And talking about this kind of binary choice, we can either continue relying on begging for alms or abandon the illusion, right? Recognize the reality, become our own boss. The answer is self-explanatory. Another article against this from the Study Times, the Central Party School newspaper, and it talks about how the ban sounded this big alarm for China's, it was the biggest alarm for China's technology security since the beginning of reform and opening, and highlighting the profound problems arising from not controlling core technology. So then we see this in a series of events that kind of parallels what was happening in terms of reactions to the Snowden revelations, right? The elevation of economic security to be part of regime security. One aspect in which this plays out quite clearly is in Xi Jinping's speech prior to the launch of the 14th five-year plan in 2021. So this is supposed to be a guiding blueprint, a set of overarching guidances for economic development. What's remarkable about his speech is that he discusses security multiple times and elevates security to the same plank as economic development, right? And calling for the need to integrate or to coordinate development and security alongside each other. And we see again then the proliferation of the security framing 1 year later at the 20th Party Congress, which is interesting in particular for the new addition of types of national security that have to do with the external economy, from supply chains to energy, maritime security, deep sea security, polar security, space security, and so on. I'm not saying that all of this is just a result from the US technology restrictions. It's playing into a complex set of domestic politics as well that has to do with Xi Jinping's own approach to governance. So it's very much an interplay between the two. At the same time, what we see in our analysis of the newspaper articles is a relative weakening in discussion of external liberalization. So what you see in the the dashed line here are phrases related to international cooperation and external liberalization. So you note that the prevalence of that liberalization theme is always higher, right, for most of this period. And then it sort of plateaus during the COVID years as a dip, as you would expect. And it's not until 2021 is the first year in which phrases related to external liberalization actually falls below phrases related to decoupling. But it doesn't fall to zero, right? It's more that the two, if you're just looking at the words, are more balanced compared to the past. So we're seeing, at least in official state media, right, less interest in external liberalization. And again, then this change in discourse, the elevation of economic security to becoming core and regime security is accompanied by institutional restructuring. So there's heightened emphasis that we see coming from China's central policies, emphasizing the need to engage in what's loosely translated into a whole of nation effort. So providing domestic capital markets for science and tech, trying to tighten linkages between these very disparate groups of actors, between universities and labs and so on. And in the spring of last year, an administrative and party state restructuring that established a new Science and Technology Commission within the Central Committee to provide, again, this greater centralized guidance, greater what the party calls unified leadership. So we have these various rounds of reorganization of what was previously a fragmented landscape, right? And a change in how China sees the importance of self-reliance in an overarching globalized landscape. What are some of the implications? So the first thing I want to emphasize is that this is not new, right? This is part of an ongoing process of redefining what self-reliance means to the party. But it's also not a return to the past, right? By no means. So China's in a state of deep integration with the world's economy. And there's a lot of de facto interdependence that remains. In particular, even in an age where geopolitical tensions are rising, it actually, to me, creates a situation where China needs the external economy more so than before, right? If we think about some of the themes that maybe we'll come back to at the end of today's conference, thinking about trade and the weakened domestic demand that we discussed earlier today, right? China's rising current account surplus indicates its reliance on external markets when its domestic economy is weak. There's a rising importance of third country markets as well, right? So we think about supply chains shifting to Vietnam, to Malaysia, and so on, as a reaction to some of the tariffs that have been imposed, fears of supply chain security, and et cetera. And if you look at the policies, there's very much a recognition, I think, coming from the central government that complete closure would simply be harmful to the Chinese economy. And there continues to be an emphasis on the need to be open to technology to the extent that it's possible. So it's more an effort to try to harden what the party sees as critical vulnerabilities in its system. What should we make of this emphasis on centralized coordination, right? I would like to highlight some of the potential unintended consequences that might come from this quest for centralized control and centralized guidance, in particular for innovation, right? What is the allocation mechanism here? There are a lot more funds available for science and technology. On what basis are these funds allocated? If the system now, right, is shifting towards one of greater central control, I don't think we have clear resource allocation mechanisms here. How does one balance innovation and security, right? Breakthroughs are to a very large extent unknown, right? So we know about the current critical technologies, but what about the next generation, right? That countries are going to be competing on as well. What are those, right? How do you balance this need for risk taking with this emphasis on security and this proliferation of security in the economic agenda? And finally, I think we need to think about the ways in which the emphasis on central guidance and central coordination can actually breed risk aversion within the system, where there's a fear of being out of step with central guidance. Again, what does that mean for innovation and for building what China hopes to be a self-reliant and competitive science and technology system? So I leave you with these thoughts, and I thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roselyn Hsueh from Temple University, and thank you so much, Jeff, for inviting me to be here today. And in some ways, it's a return, but this time in person. A few years ago, I was part of Stephen Kaplan's book launch, and it was such a delight to discuss his book, which I believe recently won an award. So congratulations to Stephen as well. So thank you so much for having me back and to be here in person. So the title of this talk, which I don't think I told Jeff about, but oh, did we lose the screen? The other one. Okay, so my apologies about that. I don't know what I did. Okay, so techno-security developmentalism and China's bifurcated capitalism in the context of globalization. So I was asked to provide some remarks and just my thoughts about China's globalization and state capitalism. And in just kind of my body of research, China's regulatory state, a new strategy for globalization that Jeff mentioned, and my recent book, Micro-Institutional Foundations for Capitalism, Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China, India, and Russia, I actually type China's capitalism as bifurcated capitalism. And I will, throughout my remarks, explain why I do so and the strategic valued logic combined with the interplay of sectoral attributes and existing organization of institutions to help us understand why this is a bifurcated capitalism and why China is actually indeed more globalized, but at the same time exerting also more state control. And that through this globalization process have indeed engaged in state building. So it's both a market building and a state building process. So I'm going to make the argument that this distinctive integration into the global economy in the context of neoliberalism has contributed to what we see today, the new political economy. It has defied conventional wisdom about the relationship between open markets and state control, with implications for authoritarian resilience. At the same time, this has paid dividends for technological development, despite some of the consequences of economic and environmental sustainability. And in that sense, my presentation today actually has a lot of synergies with the presentations that have come before and that will come after me. And that this US-China tech competition really is complicated by the economic and security nexus in this bifurcated capitalism that I will be describing. And so, first of all, what is the new political economy? How do we get here? So I will take a pathways, a longitudinal perspective in the sense that I will date the conversation today to right before and through China's World Trade Organization entry and in the period since. What is China's bifurcated capitalism? What are the implications? So I'm separating the conversation in 4 different units here, and I hope that I have enough time to get through all of them. But to begin with, what is this new political economy? My 2 books I have to plug. Okay, so in a way, in this new political economy, at least the way geopolitics and geoeconomics is being played out, is that we are in a place where it was Washington consensus, neoliberalism, and now we have the rise of China. We had a decentralization of production, finance, internet, and now we see centralization. As you could tell, what I'm showing, what I'm presenting here is that these kind of black and white stark pictures, right? A zero-sum game. And by my calling China's state capitalism a bifurcated capitalism, what I'm trying to do is that by linking the macro developments to micro level, sectoral level, and to some extent subnational level developments in China, really this zero-sum game is and does not actually capture the full picture of the complex interdependence that we see. Open markets versus protectionism. And certainly it does seem very much so that we are in an era where this zero-sum game is what we are being presented. Cooperation versus competition, right? Just in Secretary Blinken's conversations in China already and reported actually in Financial Times yesterday with the General Secretary of the Communist Party in Shanghai was that this is about whether we, the United States should choose competition versus competition, cooperation, and that whatever we choose, this is going to have implications for the world. Golden age of globalization versus what our colleagues actually here in DC, Henry Farrell and Abe Newman have talked about, this idea of weaponized interdependence. Neoliberal conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank and everything we know about it and all the dark sides of that versus what is being called China's economic coercion. And then also it's this multilateralism or decoupling. And again, what I hope to present today is to kind of challenge our thinking about this zero-sum picture and to make more complicated and complex China's bifurcated capitalism. So WTO era and what I call in my first book, China's liberalization two-step. So globalization with Chinese characteristics. And it's globalization with Chinese characteristics in the sense that I will provide some comparative perspective to other existing models of development. As we know, China liberalized and joined the WTO in 2001. And it really did appear that China had departed from the East Asian developmental state, the state-led development model, in the sense that during the Cold War, the East Asian newly industrialized countries, in many ways following the Japanese developmental state model, restricted foreign direct investment to promote the domestic sector. China integrating into the global economy, particularly during the neoliberal era, in some ways didn't have the luxury of doing so, and indeed actually did liberalize on the macro economic level. Nonetheless, China's globalization trajectory, or globalization with Chinese characteristics, also departed from the Latin American model in the sense that the FDI policies were not liberal FDI policies that came into the country, exploited and worked with domestic interests to exploit the domestic economy. Now, of course, I'm painting the East Asian model and the Latin American model in stark terms. But what I'm trying to get at is China's model departed from that. And just to provide some context in terms of in the earlier era, if we look at FDI as a percentage of GDP, China really was quite indeed open, excluding or including Hong Kong numbers. And, Taiwan, South Korea, the Japanese, the East Asian model. And then also looking at, even compared to the Latin American model, China appeared quite open. And then 2015, kind of a decade later, similar situation. Again, China was seemingly so much more open. And this gives us a cross-time perspective to before WTO entry and then after. And of course, we did see slowdown in terms of FDI's percentage of GDP over time. But that really could be true if we look longitudinally at India and Russia as well. But I do say, though, globalization with Chinese characteristics is a liberalization two-step. And by liberalization two-step, I mean that China has re-regulated in ways that vary by sector within country based on perceived strategic value logic. And the impact of that re-regulation then brings in, well, is it the central government and centralized bureaucracies that manage the FDI and the economy, or are we left with subnational variation and the differences that we do see very starkly, really, across China on the subnational level? And by terming China's state capitalism as bifurcated capitalism, I'm making the argument that, in fact, we can capture these very complex, seemingly varying picture of China's economy. Macro liberalization has made ways for policies that combine markets and state control that promote the national technology base and at the same time, national security imperatives. So we do see that economic and security nexus. And we do see this when we trace the pathways and longitudinally, it really does predate Xi Jinping and the political consolidation that is indeed very real within the Chinese Communist Party. But this bifurcated capitalism, this variation across sectors and dominant market governance structures do predate 2013 when Xi Jinping came into power. I said here. So I do want to make a nod and also just a recognition that while I talk about the institutional foundations of China's market governance and the dominant patterns of it, what I do want to make a point to say is that separately are outcomes, right? What are the implications of that bifurcated capitalism? Is it this stark picture that we see? China outperforms everyone, right? Outperforms the other two major large developing countries. I think if we bring it to the industrial sector, and then if we bring it to subsectors of the industrial sector, what we see is that the consequences, whether for technological development, here I have one measure, right, patents, but on different measures of technological investment and development, we bring it to the industrial sector, and then we further disaggregate to the subsector. In fact, the picture is more complex, and it's not that China, outperforms everyone, and that India is a basket case, right? And like, in my second book, which builds on the first, I do go into detail on the other models of development that we see in this neoliberal era. Okay, so what are the varieties of market governance, and what is China's bifurcated capitalism? I conceptualize market governance with two major dimensions. And by doing so, I am able to detect the variation across sectors and localities. And this is really important because when we think about state capitalism, we think that, state-owned enterprises make all decisions and are, they're in the strategic sectors, they're in the capital-intensive sectors. But in reality, we actually do see a quite range of distribution of property rights across strategic and non-strategic sectors. And that's why it is very important to look at these two dimensions of market governance, the level and scope of state and the market coordination, and then also what that distribution of property rights arrangements look like. In my micro-institutional foundations of capitalism, I introduce a conceptual map and taxonomy of market governance. And, I argue that the market governance will mediate globalization and development outcomes. So perceived strategic value, right? In many ways, strategic may be overused. We all may have different concepts, definitions of what strategic value means. By taking my study to India and Russia and other parts of the world, I am able to, in what I call the contextualized comparative sector approach, the CCSA, I'm very much able to identify that in fact, what is perceived of strategic value really do differ across national and subnational and sectoral contexts. And so what I mean is that we do need to look at strategic value objectively, right? So what are some benchmark objective heuristics that we could think about when we think about strategic value? Well, on the political dimension, social and political stability and regime legitimacy. And certainly the Chinese Communist Party and the legitimacy of the party is very important. External security and geopolitics will play a role. Strategic value will be about how state elite decision makers respond to internal and external pressures. Yeling just earlier made a presentation about looking at kind of new emerging technologies and the governance of that. And there are external pressures that the Chinese government has responded to on the economic dimension, contribution to the national technology base, and also economic growth and global competitiveness of industry. And I make the argument that these objective values or economic measures, conditions will shape how the state formulate goals and methods at the micro industry level, who controls industrial policy, and what kind of measures are importantly, though, and this becomes very stark when I brought my study to other developing countries and sectors, is that there is an intersubjective dimension on how state elites define, make claims upon, and contest political and economic, internal and external pressures. But if we're going to look at sectors, for all of you who are experts on industrial sectors, whether it's EV or automobiles or telecoms, sectoral structures are going to be sectoral structural attributes. Right, telecommunications is going to be telecommunications infrastructurally, terminal equipment, value-added services, whether we are in China or we are in a liberal economic context like the United States. So when we think about the type of methods and measures that are implementing or that are being brought to the fore to implement industrial policy, being taken into account will have to be the nature of technological, nature of core competencies, the type of commodity chain and domestic sectors competitive position in the global economy. Who are the users and purposes of services and products? So for example, China centralizes the governance of telecoms, very much about the fact that you need state funding to mobilize research and development, particularly at the initial levels to build infrastructure. But what else is China also concerned about? Well, who are the users? What are the purposes? Particularly if regime stability, if party legitimacy is going to be important, then part of that package of policies for industrial policy will indeed have to take into account the control of dissemination of information, right? The political dimension. And the intersubjectivity of how important that is. You know, India, of course, is concerned about that as well. There are sectarian conflicts. This is not to say that democracies and authoritarian regimes and the regime type doesn't matter. But what I'm trying to say is that sectoral structural attributes will play an important role along with the intersubjective dimension of strategic value. And then, of course, pre-existing organization of institutions. I won't have time to go into great detail about this, but what I do say is that how goals are implemented and what kind of measures are employed will take into account this interacting perceived strategic value and then also sectoral organization of institutions. Okay, so China's bifurcated capitalism. So what we see is that in the capital-intensive, value-added sectors, we have centralized market governance. This is where re-regulation after liberalization. China has indeed opened the economy to FDI. And we hear about companies that have indigenous capacity that has grown because of the strategic use of foreign direct investment. But what have we also heard about, which really has contributed to the new political economy, which is the re-regulation. Right? That centralization of economic decision-making to achieve those state goals economically and politically have enhanced central state control in these strategic sectors. Partly to resolve sectoral attributes and sectoral level characteristics, but really also state values and how in particular sectors are valued by the state. Party leading groups, state council office, central ministry, sector-specific rules are at play here. And there's a wide range of distribution of property rights. And I think this is where a lot of times we're confused. Wait, isn't it Chinese state capitalism? Then why do we see private firms and private organizations at play? Well, in the strategic sectors, we do see a wide range of distribution of property rights. What's dominant, though, in the strategic sectors tend to be, now I say tend to be, state-owned enterprises, but there are also plenty of state-controlled and state-sponsored private firms that are at play in the strategic sectors who do have economic motivation. In the non-strategic sectors and subsectors, decentralized market governance, deregulation, devolution of economic decision-making, subnational state control. And we see this across many different industries, including real estate. The Commerce Ministry and non-sector specific bureaucracies are at play. Decentralized market actors. And again, a wide range of distribution of property rights. But here, the dominant players are private firms. State-owned enterprises have not all failed or closed down, but they are not the dominant property rights arrangements. And we do see a lot of public-private partnerships. And this is going to become stark when we look at the bifurcated capitalism. As you can tell, that's what I did with the photos here, the bifurcated capitalism that we see. SMIC came into China as foreign direct investment. Now, after corporate governance interventions and perceived strategic value orientation, in responding to internal and external pressures, the central government has intervened both at the central bureaucratic level as well as the local government level. And so SMIC today is viewed as a Chinese semiconductor foundry. But in fact, in 2000, it went into Shanghai in fanfare as foreign direct investment. We also have, China leading the world on 5G technology, but a lot of that really has to do with learning from foreign direct investment, from foreign technology transfers, and dividends for indigenous capacity. At the same time, we do see subsector level variation, even in the strategic sectors. And the reason I say this is because we have private companies in the value added services, right? State infrastructure owned by China Telecom, China Mobile, and so forth. But operating on top of telecommunications infrastructure are value added services. And they historically, even before Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, historically have been more open to not just foreign direct investment, but also private investment and private entrepreneurship. And so we do see some sector variation even in the strategic sectors in terms of dominant pattern of market. Same with textiles, right? Decentralized, subnational government control, but there are subsectors of textiles, technical textiles, man-made fibers, material, high-tech materials, all listed in Made in China 2025. Those subsectors of textiles, labor-intensive, less value-added sectors, you will see more central level, provincial level guidance. But because textiles is an industry that was long deregulated and decentralized, even in the making of astronaut suits for Chinese astronauts, the man-made fibers there received obviously subsidies from central level bureaucracies, but mainly most of those corporations will fall under the private public kind of a typology of distribution of property rights. Okay. So here I just go into detail what I just talked about, centralized governance and kind of the details on those two dimensions in terms of level of state coordination, central state coordination and subnational state coordination, and then also the distribution of property rights. And here's a photo of the labor-intensive, less value-added sectors. These are case studies that represent and test the hypotheses I make about how variation in perceived strategic value interacting with sectoral attributes shape market governance. And so I'm not going to go into detail here, but what I want to say is that these dominant patterns we see play out in industrial policy in strategic emerging sectors. The strategic emerging sectors of yesteryear were telecommunications, value-added services on telecoms, which is why we have companies like Alibaba that had a lot, for example, investment from the Yahoos and the Googles and so forth. Indigenous capacity is absorbed, and then they are developed, right? But because the government does respond to, the central state does respond to internal and external pressures, state imperatives for political consolidation really indeed did play an important role in the central state intervention in Alibaba's in the intervention to control, to stop Alibaba from listing internationally, and then also the subsequent reorganization of different business units. Okay. So, and here is just examples of information communication technology. I'm not going to go into great details here, but techno-security developmentalism is the strategic value orientation that I have described and the dominant patterns that play out. So there's an economic and security nexus that in the new political economy, we do have to respond to. And I'm just want to quickly say, China's rise has given to this new political economy. Bifurcated capitalism mediates this globalization with Chinese characteristics. it's complex interdependence that we're not going to be able to decouple anytime soon. And that sector specific responses, including supply chain diversification, market diversification, and then also embracing of working with China to in its re-regulation of the economy is really what will lead to the least amount of global disruptions. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much for coming today. And I also particularly want to thank Professor Ding for inviting me to this very important and interesting panel. So I have to apologize in advance that I got a bad cold. So I apologize if I have to cough, but hopefully not. Today, I'm going to talk about global supply chains and economic statecraft in China. I'm going to draw largely on a recent international security article that I published together with Miles Evers from University of Connecticut, together with some of my own field research experience. Right now, it is around 12:30. I have about 20 minutes or so. Okay. So we have sort of entered an era of deglobalization, largely after 2010. So previously, we see an era of globalization where, I study the penetration of foreign direct investment in China's local context, and there is competition for foreign direct investment at whatever cost, and those decades are gone. Now we enter an era of deglobalization where states waging wars among each other for economic warfare. And so in the recent piece, Wars Without Gunsmoke, that just came out, Miles Evers and I have argued that global supply chains do not only bring integration and interdependence as we usually understand, but can also become weapons in the economic warfare. So the question then is to wage these wars effectively. States need support from business, but how would the state gain support from business? Or how would state deal with state-business relations? Traditional IR and the statecraft literature assumes it always does in that way, because by virtue of sovereignty, right, it would have supported business. And in fact, though, business may facilitate or impede the state's goal. Sometimes the business may agree with the state's goal, sometimes they do not. So in order to better understand the internal dynamics, we argue we want to bring the study of domestic state-business relations into the study of IPE. Now, let me clarify that it's not the case that we have not studied economic statecraft, how global value chains can be weaponized in the IPE context. Of course, we have. My own colleague, Hsueh Farwell, together with Abe Newman, have studied that extensively. But usually, even for them, the argument is not about there's fight or there is cooperation between the state and business actors within a territory. Usually, the argument is the strategy, and the way in which that global supply chains can be weaponized. But our argument is that international power transition between the dominant power and the rising power and the global supply chains, the bigger environment or the reshuffling of the IPE landscape, profoundly shape domestic state-business relations. And then the state-business relations in turn also makes future statecraft more or less effective. So we cannot assume that, business simply, especially private business, simply just go along with the state agenda. So this is a very fairly intuitive, even though seems to be complicated figure. This basically lays out the power transition and global supply chains. In the world of political economy, basically we have a largely hierarchical distribution of power, where the high value firms largely reside in the dominant states, and the low value firms largely reside in the rising states. Well, in this case, we're thinking about US and China, right? And political economic power often reinforce each other. That is to say, you hardly ever saying that, a dominant, like high value firms, which basically means those firms with much more value added. We just had Rosie talking about strategic value. I mean, the value added is different a little bit, but let me see it kind of in the similar notion, right? So hardly we would have like a low value firms residing in a dominant state and the other way. So it's tend to be, so the distribution of power in terms of dominant power and rising power in international relations politically tend to reinforce with the high value and low value firms in global supply chains. But within such systems, state and business have their interest in have their own interest and behavior. State care a lot about relative gains. This is kind of like a realist assumption, right? Dominant states wanted to maintain power and prevent a rising state from taking over, and a rising power seeks to move up the value chain because it's not satisfied with it's always being squeezed at the bottom of the value chain and thin margins of profits, sweatshops, and all those arguments. And but business interests and behavior are not necessarily the same. They care about absolute gains, and they often care a lot about commercial profits and revenue. So high value firms in this case reap large profits at the top, and low value firms earn sort of thin profits at the bottom. But low value firms also engage in large quantity of production. So they have some complementary benefits to each other. So based on this, we propose a structural theory of state business alignment. So at the beginning, there's the dominant power and rising power, where the dominant state governs high value businesses, and rising state governs low value businesses. And this, the state incentive is such that the state wanted to cut off supply chains with the rising state. The dominant power wanted to do that to prevent the further rising of the challenging state, and the rising power within the rising power, the state seeks to sufficiency and seeks industrial upgrading. So there is already a delinking or decoupling tendency. Then business within the dominant power tend to resist or circumvent state policy because they still have business interests lying in those rising markets, whereas business in the rising power have to pursue survival strategy. They're propelled to pursue survival strategy through the state support. And over time, business states relations became more conflictual in the dominant power, and the relation became more cooperative in the rising power. For the particular industrial and sector, there needs to be a sector perspective, right? Particular industrial sector that we see the weaponization of global value chains. So if you're interested, you can read the paper, but the paper itself has like 4 different country cases. There's a pair of UK, Germany, and there's a pair of US, China. And obviously, because of the time constraints, and I'm going to only focus on the US, China case. So before the tech war happened, the US state business relation is such that US firms are not the largest beneficiary from the global value chains. They're reaping profits through technology. They specialize in investing R&D. They dominate the global value chain as the lead firms. And we think about Qualcomm, Intel, and all those firms, and Apple, right? And they gained advantage through such kind of hierarchical structure. And they also advocate for liberalizing trade control because China used to be the second largest, and now it's the largest market for semiconductors. They largely have the argument. You can see them through the Semiconductor Industrial Association's documents and through some of the other firms' argument as such. Now, the U.S. state, however, at that time, before the tech war, that's pre-2010, views technology innovation also as crucial to state power and U.S. domination. So there is the sort of unchallenged bipartisan view of technology as driver of economic success. They all sort of more agree. And the National Security Council particularly believed the United States could keep running faster than China in developing the ICT industry, and which differ China from direct competition. That is to say, at the time, they think, liberalizing trade control is fine as long as the United States can run faster could keep running faster than China. And that kind of sort of largely aligns with the business interests, because business are going for liberalizing the trade control during that time. Then there's the US-China tech war taking place. First, we see this tendency even back in 2012, a congressional report on Huawei and ZTE, and then this is followed by export ban through entity list of Huawei and others. And this is especially of the talking about the tech war, not necessarily the trade war overall, because trade war also involves tariffs. But in terms of tech war, we see the 2019 BIS ban as a Bureau of Industry Security ban on American hardware and EDA software, but that left loopholes, of course, of going through the third party. That's when also Huawei started to stock up on the chips, and we see there in that period, it's also COVID that we see that there's a shortage of chips. And then there's the 2020 ban of any third part of not going through any third party using American equipment of software. Then there's a further ban under the Joe Biden government of exporting chip making equipment, supercomputer components, and U.S. persons supporting fabrication of 16 to 14 nanometers on chips. And they also expanded the scope under the foreign direct product rule. So what count as foreign direct product? Also, the scope also expanded. So every run, they started to close some of the loopholes and trying to make the ban more targeted and more strict. So the U.S.-China and business interests after the tech war is such that, as we mentioned, U.S. government perceived the threat and cut off supply chains, as we already mentioned. And the U.S. firm at the time still enjoying the complementary benefits. They lobbied against the tech war because basically lost a pure $30 billion unknown, with the Huawei ban unknown wiped out a $30 billion US dollars. And they also they lobbied for pursuing a global value chain, opening up for a global value chain. And they also pursued circumventing strategies. For example, you see firms like Intel and Xilinx lobby against, also Qualcomm lobby against directly, or saw some of the Western Digital and Seagate continue to ship hard drives, and later Congress found out that. And the Semiconductor Industry Association or Telecommunication Industry Association also have large paragraphs of quotes arguing for global value chains. I wouldn't dwell on those in detail. And they see Synopsys and Cadence are continue to earn high profits from non-entity list firms, because there's also firms in China that are not on the entity list. And Qualcomm continue to sell chips to Honors, because Honors was a spin-off from Huawei, right? And then, of course, NVIDIA suddenly emerged. And before that, nobody knows NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA suddenly emerged as the first company that developed chip for China that satisfies export control. And the people are like, what is this firm, NVIDIA? And then, the CEO of NVIDIA now is traveling all around the world to give talks. But before this tech war, I myself haven't to pay attention to NVIDIA. So the state business interest started to diverge in the initial period of the tech war. And there's some sort of compromise from the Commerce Department. You could argue, for example, the Commerce Department could say, okay, you can apply for exemptions. If your chips are not targeted at 5G, that is fine. You can still continue to apply for exemptions and things like that. So I have to qualify or have to qualify against the complete argument about a divergence. So the China state and business interest before tech war, unlike a lot of people have assumed that the firms are typically just the tools of the party state and go along whatever the party state asks it to do. We see that the Chinese state has a real ambition of vertical technology upgrading that move up the value chain. You see that in indigenous innovation in 2006 and Made in China 2025 that's launched in 2014, showing that it's unsatisfied with its status. During Q&A, if or afterwards, we can chat about these two are not really necessarily the same. But for now, let me say that they all show that they showed unsatisfied with its status, like the state wanted to move up. The Chinese firms' horizontal expansion has been the dominant tendency for a lot of firms at the time. I'm talking about, around 2010, like before or after 2010, right? So the higher management's tendency to expand horizontally often won out over the R&D department's decision to move vertically. That happened during a lot of my interviews when I ask, if you know that it's important to do innovation, to move up the value chain, why do you not want to just move up the value chain? Oh, there's a lot of reasons. I'll detail later, such as I do not want to offend my upstream customers, things like that. But also because there is a debate internally in there. There is, during this period, you see a state business interest misalignment, and they played out through several decades. For example, earlier on, we all know there's a joint venture stage or sort of unsuccessful marriage. That's also the stage we see exchange markets for technology that China is trying to say, I can give you the China market if you, joint venture can set up and give us the technology. And largely, doesn't work out because there's awkward marriage that each side, the one side does not want to give all the technology, the other side also does not actively norm, contrary to a lot of the technology stealing argument. It actually, SOE especially do not have the incentive to norm. That there is a SOE problem that we can talk later about state-owned firms. But a global supply chain stage come in 1990s and 2000s, where China can take advantage of global value chain and have created a lot of wealth and a lot of GDP, right? But during that time, actually the hardest competition at lower literature markets, even for Huawei and ZTE, during that time, they're competing at a lower literature market, or they're competing in developing countries. The reason was that the structure chain is such that even they're like star firms that people often hear about. So some of the terms such as like wolf culture, things like that, actually came out of Huawei's fierce fight with ZTE, not because Huawei fight with USA, but Huawei's fight with ZTE. That during those fighting process, there's a lot of anecdote I can share later, but that they came out this thing of wolf culture associated with Huawei or some things like those anecdotes. Actually, during this period, there is certain kind of not in completely alignment of state and business interest. And so it's hard to implement some of the upgrading initiatives because of misalignment of the interest. And that was more thoroughly explored in my 2018 book that Professor Ding also briefly mentioned. Now, the Chinese state, after the tech war, or more precisely, since the happening of the tech war, the Chinese state was galvanized to promote techno-nationalism. And I think Professor Yeling Tan has already done a lot, so I would not delve into this for very long. But let me mention, for example, that President Xi Jinping has emphasized self-reliance in science and technology repeatedly for many times. And he himself actually recently, well, maybe just last year, just published this book, right? Here right in this image that you can see, where the book itself is on the science and technology self-independence and self-strength, right? If it's a direct translation. That gathered all his thoughts and talks and speeches. And there's a refocus on core crucial technology, what in Chinese called 核心关键技术 in hardware, 29 billion unknown in Guangzhou alone was raised for semiconductors. But actually at the national level, it was estimated every year $200 billion was poured into the semiconductor industry. Then they established a nationwide system in science and technology, vertically connecting various levels of government from provincial to local government, and horizontally connecting universities, research institute, and companies. So there are also Yes, I'm being looking at a time. And there are also a tiered system of gazelles and unicorns and target. Well, they always like to use animal names of targeting at different size of the firms. And there's intensive use of government guidance funds and the venture capitals, and also direct tax exemptions for the semiconductor industry during this time. This is just some quick field work, a picture of how they're continually evaluating tech firms in some of the high tech zones. This is actually even during COVID, so you could vaguely see that people are wearing masks, and there are a lot of documents accumulating that they have to submit documents, and they have a group of experts in evaluating. The Chinese business interest since the tech war is such that they were sort of forced to develop technology for business survival. And they, for example, Huawei's have investing in EDA startups and HiSilicon and ZTE and SMIC also made progress. These affected firms accelerate the choke point technology development and start to poach talent from US and Taiwan. They increase there is also increasing technology demand for high-tech startups that have not previously found markets or customers to scale up, because they were like, if we are a high-tech startup, just focus on chips, right? But previously, most of the firms would rather buy chips from Intel, buy chips from Qualcomm. Why would they buy chips from us, right? Without customer, we cannot scale up. We cannot have customer feedback. We cannot make progress, right? So this is also opportunity for them, because even firms that are not directly affected by this started to hedge, right? Making considerable progress in 7 and 5 nanometer semiconductors. Powering the artificial intelligence is another phenomenon that we see, and mostly with the SMIC and Huawei, with these 2 firms. And then there's some chip tool firms started making progress. Won't go into detail. So state business interests started realign, and there's a huge amount of emphasis on hardcore technology rather than the internet firms. And you can see that chips and AI executives were favored over the internet tycoons in some of the political consultative meetings and People's Assembly. So some of the old internet firms started to be lost, become not the state's favorite, but state favorite firms seems to be some of the chip firms, semiconductor firms. That's their understanding of what is high technology. That's their understanding of what is tech firms. So to conclude, the distribution power in the world economy have shaped domestic interest alignment, and later can make the weaponization supply chain more or less effective. And we need a more dynamic rather than static theory. I have to caveat that this is focused on certain short midterm effects and hardware technology. But when the tech war took place between 2 rivals with direct business conflicts, the picture is different. For example, a case that would be good to incorporate, and we haven't, is the US and Japan tech war in the 1980s, because at that time it was 2 direct technology giants conflicting with each other, even though there is also economic statecraft and weaponization, that there's a direct business interest conflict. That is to say, even the US firms at the time perceive there is a threat from the Japanese semiconductor firms. Then, of course, US and US government firms are all united together in that fight, because at that time it's not complementary anymore. It's not that US firms has a complementary interest with Japanese firms. They're directly competing with each other, which is a very different case. But Japan at that time was not a rising country. It's already like a power. It's already past its peak, right? So it's a different picture. But in the end, I would like to say that this is completely a moving picture, what I'm presenting. So maybe there's one day after 30 years, China had a breakthrough and have finally a chip made a breakthrough in the chip industry. When that day happens, perhaps then the US firm and the US government all rally together. But also at the time, if they really already make a breakthrough in the chip, the semiconductor chips, then the US would also lose the tools for weaponization of global value chain. Thank you very much, and look forward to your questions.
Hi. Hi, my name is Stanley, and I am currently with the Atlantic Council. I have a question for Professor Chen Ling. And it is about like how, so in terms of like the state business relations, especially in the United States, we know that lobbying and like there are tools that the business can transmit their message to the government. And is the China actively using this tool to navigate through how US responses to China can be most disorganized and like least harmful to China? For example, can China strategically leverage some core industries in the United States, some crucial firms like NVIDIA, and use it kind of in China's advantage to help the US, not treat China as harsh as possible? Is it in China's plan, and how can China maximize such a tool? Thank you.
Thank you. If I understand your question correctly, you're not just only saying can US firms lobby the government to do something, you're also saying if China can use this opportunity to maximize and put pressure on the US firm then to lobby the US government. Although there is such possibility, but thus far I would say that US firms are largely just looking out for their own interests. So I think it's their own behavior. I don't think there is like a conspiracy or something behind where the Chinese government are asking US firms to do that and US firms then lobby against the US government. Maybe there is some like behind the doors thing that I do not know, but thus far I only see US firm as kind of sort of protecting their own interest. That's what my answer is.
I am not sure which one of you will respond to the question. I'm interested in the role of the two currencies that dominate the cross-border payments are US dollar and euro. So I'm interested in the role of technology in promoting renminbi or other digital currency, or what do you see of the role of the renminbi?
You mentioned currency randomly in the slides. Yeling, didn't you have like, you had one bullet point that said something about currency supply? Do you want to take this one, or Rosie?
Well, I could take a firm or sector level perspective in that. If we look at technological development, e-payment or fintech, I think that as China increases its indigenous capacity in those areas, and as Chinese firms and those globalize, then I do think that increasingly one of the goals can be, and I think in fact is something that the Chinese government is interested in, which is to push Chinese currency through the firm development and sector development in markets abroad. And in fact, many of you probably have seen already that in many the kind of restaurants, or when we use like Uber Eats or food in countries around the world, in fact, Chinese fintech apps or platforms are used, and that's I think a very good platform for a currency to be published.
Great. Let's take one more question for Professor Tan. Yeah, please.
I was wondering whether the panel has any view on whether China has any possible retaliatory reaction to the recent decision on TikTok.
This is not something I've looked closely at, but if people in the audience want to correct me, please feel free to. But my impression is that China has its own legislative efforts attempted to make that divestiture illegal on Chinese grounds. So where you see TikTok now is being caught between two different legal and regulatory structures. And it seems like TikTok's strategy at the moment is to try to drag it out through legal pathways, because they're caught between the rock.
I think TikTok has to respond to kind of the US legal context as well. So, Yeling is right that, in itself, within the US system, it's a long process to actual implementation of of the decision. I think on the Chinese side, I think one potential kind of historical case on Chinese government's use of divestment or forcing divestment from foreign direct investment will be in telecoms in the late 1990s. During the time, right before China acceded into the World Trade Organization, there were many foreign, even though technically foreign direct investment was banned in telecoms, there were a lot of kind of these variable equity kind of structures, CCFs that they were called, in Chinese foreign. And right before WTO session, in order to make sure that Chinese companies had, ownership of many of these operators and value-added service providers, the Chinese government actually forced the divestment of foreign direct investment in telecoms. And this is prior to WTO accession. So that's kind of like, a historical case. Now, I think that I don't think though, in terms of now, the Chinese government would support the divestment of TikTok owned by games.
Great. I know we had a bunch of other hands. I'll let you all swarm the panelists yourselves, and then everyone else can get lunch too. So thank you all so much for